Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the AILA Earth Summit. We've got a fantastic panel for you today to kick things off. This is sustainable transportation, moving towards cleaner vehicles and better mobility. And I think this is a critically important topic, both in a news sense, obviously with all the things happening with the Biden administration and in Congress, but also, tying it back to here in Los Angeles. This has always been very much a ecosystem that's all about transportation and technology and advancements at the intersection of those two fields. No pun intended. I'm really excited about the panelists we've got here. We've got three doctors, so everyone's much smarter than me. We've got Dr. Rajit Gadh, Professor of Engineering and Director of UCLA Smart Grid Energy Research Center. We've got Dr. Kalai Ramea, Research Manager at Palo Alto Research Center, PARC. And of course, Dr. Colin Sheppard, Chief Technology Officer at Marain. Again, I'm Jonah Bliss. I'm VP of New Media and Marketing at CoMotion. I've spent my career trying to get people out of traditional mobility into more fun, sustainable, interesting ways to get around their cities. But why don't we start by hearing from our panelists, give a little bit of background about themselves. So Rajit, let's start with you.
Hi, I'm a professor at UCLA. Thank you so much for having me. My research interest lies at the intersection of electric mobility and electric charging infrastructure that has a very big, profound impact on the electric grid, and how electric mobility connects to the infrastructure, charging stations, and how that connects to the grid, and how do you manage that? Some of the research problems that we have been working on in UCLA involve integrating EV chargers with stationary batteries and solar panels behind the meter, because if you start adding infrastructure, heavy power, heavy duty infrastructure for charging vehicles, and you're just drawing all the power from the grid all the time, you could be that could result in heavy load on the grid. The other interesting area of research that we're looking at is medium duty, heavy duty fleets. And when the fleets, whether it's a bus or a truck, when it returns the evening, 5, 6 p.m. and you plug in, and if you just do charging at that time, you're going to add to the grid's load. That's the time we already have a peak load in California, and you're adding to that. The question is, how do you mitigate that? Do you move charging later in the night, or do you have some vehicles come in the middle of the day? So we look at that piece of it is smart scheduling. The third thing we're looking at is called vehicle to grid, V2G. That means, can you use the vehicles as a battery storage device when the vehicle is not in use? A lot of the cars are just sitting around for 80, 90% of the day, and can use the battery of that vehicle as an energy storage device when the grid needs power. And so we're looking at some of these interesting issues, specifically an interesting research project we did recently with local electric utilities. Here's a bus coming in, and the bus needs to, let's say, charge in what's called opportunity charging, or corridor charging, which is coming in during the middle of the day. It plugs in, it needs very high levels of charging, maybe 150, 200 kilowatts, and then it's on its way. Well, that is causing a massive peak. And the question is, can you use that battery storage that I talked about in the first sentence of my, when I was talking about what we do? Can you have a battery on site, and then you can take the part of the power from the battery and the remainder from the grid. And when there's no vehicle there, when there's no bus, you can then charge the battery from the grid, thereby lowering the peak. So we're looking at, from an infrastructure standpoint, can you use smart algorithms? Can you predict when the next bus is going to come? And can you predict how much energy it's going to need, and things like that? And so can you do prediction, and then you do management, and you do control of the infrastructure? So we're all about smart infrastructure as opposed to sort of the worst case infrastructure. Thank you.
It sounds like we're gonna have a lot to talk about. Kalai, how about yourself?
Yeah, so thanks for having me here. So my name is Kalai Ramea. I work at Palo Alto Research Center. It used to be called Xerox PARC. For those who don't know, it was established in the 1970s and one of the pioneering institutions in HCI, human-computer interface. Since then, we have diversified into several areas. Energy is one of them. I manage the data science and machine learning team at PARC. So a lot of what I'm going to talk through will handle a lot of data, and that comes into my background as well. I did my PhD in integrated assessment models. That means, if you want to do a policy change or analysis for a certain region, usually policymakers want to understand how a certain thing will affect in the long term. For instance, if you want to give subsidies to people to buy electric vehicles more, we want to be able to say, okay, if you do it in this year, 2020, then what's going to happen in 2050? So I dealt with those kinds of models, brings in a lot of behavioral component to it, in addition to infrastructure and we do a lot of future scenario analysis, and we identify the best pathway for those and go from there. Personally, I'm very passionate about sustainable transportation and climate. I drive a fuel cell electric car, so as opposed to EV. So I did a lot of pros and cons analysis in choosing that. So I'm bringing my own behavioral component to it, why that happens. Since owning a fuel cell electric car, I did publish 2 papers related to hydrogen energy based on my experience in dealing with infrastructure. So I did a survey, I did a quantitative data analysis, especially in California, because this is the only state that has hydrogen fueling infrastructure. So we wanted to see if the state is planning to improve it in installing next 100 hydrogen stations moving forward. And this is for light duty vehicles. What needs to happen, how to win consumer trust, especially in hydrogen as opposed to battery electric. So those are the questions I'm usually pondering. And in general, I'm passionate about electric vehicles, public transit, hydrogen, whatever. You know, we want to give incentives to people, not one. I mean, one T-shirt doesn't fit everyone. So we need to understand what kind of tailored incentives that we should be giving to people so that we all reach that climate target goal. So that's what I'm more interested in. I'm willing to talk about the details of it.
Thank you. And Colin, how about yourself?
Great, thanks. Colin Sheppard, I'm CTO at Marain. And actually, before I came to Marain, which was about a year ago, I was a research scientist at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. And I worked for about 4 or 5 years for the Department of Energy doing analysis on transportation, sustainability, electrification, including travel demand modeling, very similar work to what Kalai was mentioning. While I was doing that work, you know, we were trying to analyze all of the different new innovations in technology, business models, and that are coming into the transportation system all at once, coupled to the fact that we have big changes happening on the power sector, and doing everything we could to try to make sense of all of that in an integrated systems way, where you're really trying to wrap your arms around as much of that system all at once. And you know, I've sort of reported out on some of the pluses and minuses associated with some of the different sort of individual technologies or approaches or modes in the transportation system. But you know, I really think that we can't afford to try to pick any winners right now. We really have to keep pushing forward all of these opportunities, whether it's electrification of personal vehicles, whether it's shared autonomous electric vehicles, which is really the focus of our work at Marain, whether it's enhanced, more accessible transit that's cheaper, et cetera, all the hydrogen, all the above. Like, we really shouldn't be, you know, sort of tying our hands behind our back right now. We have too much to lose. So, so that's kind of my thesis. But I should say that while at Lawrence Berkeley Labs, so I was really thinking about all of these different opportunities, there was one thing that I couldn't really get out of my mind, which is that when it comes to EVs, I really think that we're in grave danger that EVs is going to become just another front in the politicized culture war in our country. And I think that nearly half of the country is going to just refuse without thinking 1 or 2 steps further, that refuse to ever even consider owning an EV, and they're going to fiercely resist any mandates that would come from the government to, you know, require that they drive EVs. Now, I could be wrong here. I hope I'm wrong, but I should say this: getting individual people to decide to buy an EV is very different than getting people to just order a vehicle from an app, and that vehicle happens to be electric, that comes fast and cheap, picks them up, takes them where they want to go. They don't have to deal with parking, blah, blah, blah. Like, all of the benefits associated with the sort of autonomous vehicle revolution that will happen. It's not a matter of whether, it's a matter of when. I think that there's a big opportunity there to be an important part of the solution. It is not the whole solution, But this is why I joined Marain. This is why I really want to help accelerate that that sector forward, because I do think that there's big opportunity to get more EV miles under the seats of everybody, not just the people who are sort of in the early adopter segment of our society.
Thank you, Colin. And I think that's a great place to start. I mean, in terms of this conversation, let's think about it in terms of, today, our vehicle mix in America is very, private automotive oriented. So I think we should talk about, how do we push that to either be electrified, or if it makes sense to make that hydrogen powered. Then we can also think about, to your point, shared vehicles and kind of other, autonomous vehicles, kind of smarter ways to use the same kind of format. And then, I want us to also think about other forms of transportation, whether it's public transit or micromobility, et cetera. I think that last part that you made, Colin, is really interesting about the culture war. One thing we've seen a lot of the big three automakers do is seemingly almost in response to that is so many of the EVs that have come out in the last year or so, they're these giant, quote unquote, manly Hummer EVs, gigantic trucks for the suburban warrior, which obviously increases the energy load needed, increases the grid power necessary to charge that. And it's also still has all the problems about a large vehicle with stopping distance particulates from the wear and tear and tires and whatnot. But so big EVs, big batteries. Let's start, Rajit. As we're getting the country ready for EVs, seemingly bigger and bigger ones, what kind of steps are necessary to put an EV in the most people's driveways?
Yeah, so I think that if you look at California, I'm just going to start with California here. Roughly half of our population lives in multi-unit dwellings, apartment, condos, and things like that. And the other half live in single-family homes. And the percentage of people living in MUDs in California is increasing. And so if you think about someone who wants to, and when we started our research, we were working with on a DOE grant in 2009 with the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power. And that's when the research started. And we realized that if someone is living in an MUD, in fact, one of the first acquirers of a Nissan Leaf was someone who lived in an MUD working in our department, and he couldn't charge at home. He had to charge at work. So as part of our research, we had installed from that grant 150 EV charging stations. And this was in partnership with the Department of Water and Power. And so we learned how to install charging stations in the campus, how do you manage them and things like that for both workplace charging and fleets. Well, there's a third segment called MUD, multi-unit dwelling charging, and that is very challenging because you have the associations that are managing these dwellings, and who's going to pay if you're renting an apartment for 1 year? Who's going to pay for the charger? The charger might only be $300, but the infrastructure cost might be 10 grand. So the question is, and so there's the economics of it, and so what happens is that where will people charge is a very big question, right? So if you're an MUD, you can't have charging at home, then maybe we need street side charging. For example, I looked at some interesting programs that DWB had talked about, whereby you could have a charger attached to a sort of electric or a light pole. And so you have some street side charging, charging at workplace. So workplace charging is a great way to overcome that problem of not having the facilities at home. So the one big question which someone wants to buy an electric car vehicle, and we're 10 years into it. 2011 was when the first Nissan Leafs were coming out. We're 10 years into it, but when people who are, not the early adopters, but you get into the early majority, they're going to ask, where should I charge? So the more chargers there are, the better off you are. And that's the first thing. The second thing is, what is the modality of charging? Is it going to be trickle charging? So at night, you can literally you can take a 110 volt outlet. For example, in my home, I have both 110 and 220. And you can just charge it for 8-10 hours, and that's fine. At night, you're not doing anything. So trickle charging works in such a situation. Now, maybe for workplace charging, you need 220 volts. That gives you about 20 to 25 miles an hour charging. And then for other types of charging, maybe you need your fast charging. You're on the go like a gas station model, and so you go and you want in and out in 5-10 minutes. So you need all of the above. Different types of infrastructure is needed for different use case and different types of drivers. But the infrastructure is the biggest challenge today, and that has to be solved via a combination of grants, incentives, programs, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, and you're talking to someone that personally runs an extension cord out his apartment window to charge his Volt, so familiar with that problem. Kalai, this is sort of, gets back to the existential question of, EVs versus, say, hydrogen, because hydrogen, I don't think we're expecting people to put little hydrogen tanks in their apartments. So it's more traditional kind of gas station model. So how do you see that kind of debate shaping out about EVs versus hydrogen?
Yeah, so it's very interesting because as Rajit was explaining the workplace charging and all of those things, this is exactly what we do as econometric modelers, right? We try to capture these this utility cost. Like how do people perceive different kinds of inconveniences? For instance, range anxiety is still a huge issue for EVs, and charging is another huge issue. So if, as very rightly Rajit said, like if people don't have workplace charging, we see a huge drop in adopting EVs. Or even if you have workplace charging, and when more and more people adopt it, they have to scale it up. And that doesn't happen easily. Otherwise, they have to go into this scheduling system, like, you only allot 2 hours per day to charge. That may not be, a feasibility for everyone. So it's a huge contention. Like, there's charger congestion, there's range anxiety, and those are all disutility costs that people perceive, depending on how far you drive and what is your family size and all that. Now, why I chose hydrogen vehicle as opposed to EV was part of this process. Yes, our workplace has chargers, but it is something like I have to charge every day or every other day. And so many people have Teslas now, and everybody is getting Nissan Leaf. So that is part of my decision making. Like, with hydrogen vehicle, it's almost like a gasoline vehicle. Like I can charge within 5 minutes. It gives me 300-mile range. I'm good to go in a week. It gives the same range as EV, is 300 miles, as same as Nissan Leaf or anything else. And the price range was almost the same. So that was my decision. And part of the hydrogen related issues are, people always do not have these hydrogen refilling stations next to their house. You cannot have an hydrogen charger in your garage. I mean, that is a huge risk, and I wouldn't recommend that. People shouldn't be doing that. You can have an EV charger. So if you're living in a multi-housing unit, like Rajit mentioned, and if you don't have access to EV charger, and if you want to buy a zero emission vehicle for the same cost, I would totally recommend hydrogen is the way to go, as long as you have a hydrogen charger next to it. Good news is the state of California is planning to expand the refueling stations. I know Southern California has a lot of them, and we have about 15 stations in Northern California. And reliability is an issue. We have been facing that. So I consider myself as an early adopter. So I was ready to face those things. You don't always get hydrogen like electricity. Sometimes it hits a snatch, and you may have to be ready for that. Thankfully, the automakers who are making these vehicles, they are willing to give out rental cars on those days where you don't have to have access to hydrogen. So there are workarounds. It's still at an early stage compared to EV. It has been like a decade since the EV revolution started, but hydrogen is, the first model came out in 2015. So we are still under the 5-year mark. So there are still ways to go, but I just want to say, like, these are the alternatives. There are different factors that people weigh in when they're trying to buy an alternative fuel vehicle, for a general word. Even if you want to buy natural gas vehicles, for example. I mean, these are the same questions that people ask. So that's why it's absolutely necessary to understand the limitations and to give choices, because what might fit me might not fit you. You may have a superpower charger in your garage, and it makes no sense to get a hydrogen vehicle in that case. So yeah, that's my view of these things.
Colin, how does your specific culture war concern? Do you think people will be more responsive to having big explosive hydrogen cars? It sounds pretty manly.
I don't know. We should give it a try. I really think we should. I don't think we should take options off the table right now. But I mean, I do think that hydrogen is definitely behind in the kind of EV hydrogen race. But again, that doesn't mean it shouldn't be a part, or it won't be a part of the solution. We should also note that there's nothing technically that can prevent us from having plug-in hybrid electric vehicles that have have hydrogen as the backup. And that, I drive a PHEV because, I need to make like long distance drives frequently. And it's just much more convenient to have that gas engine as a backup, but I would gladly replace it with hydrogen if I could. Again, I really do think all the above is the right answer for now. I realize that there is a fixed pie. There's a little bit of a zero-sum game happening. So right now at the federal level, the infrastructure plan or the jobs plan involves a lot of spending on transportation. I think that is important, that it's vital, that should be happening. But there is a certain amount that was proposed for EVs versus transit, and that has ruffled feathers, and people are starting to, go at it. And there should be a healthy debate about the merits. And we do have to make hard decisions about what we're going to invest in and by how much. But I also think that none of these should be all or nothing. It really should be a matter of degree.
We need a lot of tools in our arsenal. One thing that I think is great about hydrogen is its potential for heavy duty or medium duty, sort of big long range trucking fleets of the world. It's got great energy density, and also it solves some of that kind of the quandary about where to refuel, because if I have a car, I might be like, well, I'm going to drive to Arizona and they don't have hydrogen there, but where truck routes go, that's all planned out in advance. And even if you go somewhere that doesn't currently have a hydrogen station, you can be like, okay, well, we need to add one to hub number 12. Kalai, how do you see hydrogen working for that kind of application?
I think that is hydrogen will lead in that industry, in my opinion, because it's easy to have hydrogen refueling station, like you mentioned. We know the exact truck routes, so it's easy to have them. It has a longer range. They don't have to compromise with the battery size and everything. So it is much easier for trucking industry to adopt hydrogen for heavy duty and medium duty vehicles. Light duty is another question. It's unless we find a solution for multi-housing units to have easy charging, they don't really have an option to get an electric car. So if they have to get a hydrogen car, it has to be a lot cheaper than what it is now. So there's always all of those questions that need to be answered in that case. But trucking, yes. And also, like, if we are also talking about autonomous trucking, I'm sure Colin could answer some of that. That means, electric mobility is also on the rise. So we need both, definitely.
Yeah. Rajit, I suppose, if I were to snap my fingers and say everything's electrified tomorrow, the grid wouldn't be ready, especially if we're doing trucks with just humongous energy demand. What kind of steps do we need to put in place to get us there?
Yeah. So, we work very closely with a lot of truck fleet operators in the ports of Long Beach and LA. And so there are different types of trucks, right? So that's called the first mile, or the drayage, or that's a medium MDHD, medium duty, heavy duty trucks. And then we also work with the last mile sort of delivery. Those tend to be smaller trucks. The last mile trucks, they're well on the way to getting electrified. There's companies like Rivian and a bunch of other companies that are already offering the product, right? And you heard about the big news between Amazon and Rivian. Now, if you look at the let's call it the first mile, the containers, the 40-foot containers that come off the ships at the ports of LA and Long Beach, and there's 18,000 trucks today that are mostly diesel based. And so you look at, from the electric truck standpoint, what can electric trucks do? Well, it turns out that roughly 2/3 of all trucking applications require less than 200 miles a day. And now if you look at the OEMs, the manufacturers, like you look at Daimler Trucks North America, if you look at Volvo or Tesla or BYD, many of these companies that have been doing pilots in these ports, they're already talking about trucks with 200 to 250 miles range now. They're already talking. That means that for 2/3 of your application, you have, you need to not just think about the grid, you need to think about the vehicles, the charging infrastructure, and the grid, all three of them, and can they serve the duty cycles? So you're already getting to the point where 2/3 the duty cycles needs, 2/3 the needs of duty cycles of fleet operators can be met with electric trucks. Now, that's of course a little bit of optimistic, rosy scenario, because you still need to have the charging infrastructure, which is largely missing today. And you mentioned it correctly with the grid operators. Where are the challenges? Well, one big challenge is, let's say you're a fleet operator, you want to get the charging stations and you want to install them. Well, you need a connection to the grid. So there are really two ways to connect to the grid. One is you can say, well, let's say I have, but there's one more thing, technology. There's a technology called MCS that stands for Megawatt Charging Standard, or called CHARIN. and an organization called Sharon is actually coordinating that. And what that does is that gives you a megawatt charging. Those prototypes are already available. They're going to go into production estimated next year. They will give you 100 miles of charging for a truck in 10 minutes. That means you stop at a truck stop, in 30 minutes you're full. Now, it's not there yet because, as I mentioned, you can have the charging stations available, let's say in the next year or two, but infrastructure. Yes, now let's get to the grid. That means, let's say if you put in 10 of those chargers, 10 1 megawatt chargers, now you need a 10 megawatt connection. Will you take a 10 megawatt connection? The answer is no. What you want to do is you want to install battery storage locally. It's called behind the meter. Some people call it a microgrid. Some people call it distributed energy resource integration solution. What that does is you can have a maybe 4 or 5 megawatt connection to the grid, and yet you can serve most of the trucks most of the time. In engineering, if you ever want a 100% solution, it is almost infinitely expensive. You always have what's called a service level agreement. You can have 99.9% or 99%. So having a smart charging infrastructure of the nature I told you is what is going to help the grid operator. Now let's go to the grid operators. They take time. Once you say, I want to have a 10 megawatt connection, that takes time. That may take 1 or 2 years. And that is one of the challenges. And I think the grid operators, they're already putting a lot of effort, especially in California, to actually help with that, trying to decrease that time. But I think that requires the ability to have more generation. Well, it turns out that generation is not sort of the biggest problem right now. The biggest problem is just getting this interconnection into this massive grid. So that's, I think, a big challenge is charging station and connecting to the grid. But I think it's happening very, very quickly in California, and especially in Southern California. And I think our fleet operators in the ports are very excited about this approach.
Yeah, and then I think one other important thing just note is that it's also just so important from a environmental justice standpoint. Obviously, not the long-term greenhouse gas, but diesel particulates, low-income communities by the port. So this is
So I do want to talk about environmental justice because that is at the center of our conversation in the last 3 years, pretty much every week or every day. So if you look at, let's look at the truck stop of the future or the charging station of the future. This idea of that, I can get 100 miles in 10 minutes is not going to happen today. There is a technology that I can put in that will give me 100 miles in 30 minutes. Well, that's not bad. So I can do that today. I have a truck, I pull in, I got 30 minutes. What do? I need to have a cafe, a restaurant, I need to do something. All of these truck stops are going to have to think very differently. The traditional truck stop is not going to be the model of the future. It's going to be a completely different model. New technology, job opportunities in these ports. These are highly disadvantaged communities along the 710 corridors, which is again disadvantaged. So I look at these truck stops of the future have to do things. There'll be restaurants. Well, there'll be jobs there, and then the jobs will be local because someone has to be there local because you have to go, manage the restaurant, operate the restaurant. So there'll be opportunities for entrepreneurs. And to me, this truck stop of the future is a very, very exciting idea. And I think we just are barely even scratching the surface. I don't even know what's going to look like, but it's going to be different from the truck stop of the past.
I can't wait to try the bathroom at the scary truck stop of the future. Colin, I don't want to forget about you. I think there's such an important nexus between autonomous vehicles and electric vehicles here. I mean, you can't basically have an AV without an EV. Can you maybe speak a little bit to what that quickly approaching intersection looks like and how autonomy can make electrification more rampant and more efficient?
Yeah, you're right. And in fact, in some places like the state of California, there's a new policy that I think is being discussed or is on the table that would literally mandate that autonomous vehicle ride-hail systems have to be electric when they come online. So yes, there are some companies that are working with ICEs still and putting their autonomous tech on top of them, but even those companies, Aurora being an example, like they see the writing on the wall. They realize that they need to be thinking about electrification as well. Plus, it has the benefit that it's cheaper, right? So it's just better for the bottom line. And when you're dealing with a fleet, you have much more flexibility in the system. So it's a lot easier to rotate these vehicles in and out in the middle of the day and allow them to charge when they need to be, when it's cheap to charge. You can aggregate the charging of all these vehicles together, and you can use that to provide flexibility services to the grid, which is something these companies can monetize So this is a big, feature of the work that we do at Marain, is trying to think through these solutions now and what the control schemes would look like. But I'll also say that it's challenging, right? The logistics around charging do introduce new friction into the operation of these fleets. You have to be taking vehicles off the road, sometimes at inconvenient times of day when demand is high for the service. And so, the logistical challenges require you to think through how you're going to operate these fleets, what is going to be the size of the fleet, the range of the vehicles, how big are the batteries, where your depot is going to be, how many depots are you going to have in a city, how big should they be, how many stalls do you need, how many chargers, should they be slower chargers, 20 kilowatt, should they be 50, 100 kilowatt chargers? All of these questions sort of have to go into the deployment of these fleets. And these are the things that most of these companies have, I'll just say, have spent almost zero time and effort thinking through, because they're all focused on just getting the vehicles to drive safely, as they should be. But this is sort of, I would say the next decade is when all of the real work is going to go into designing and deploying these fleets. They will become a ubiquitous a part of our transportation system. And I'll say that there is something that's definitely a curveball, because meanwhile, while we're doing that, we should also be thinking about electrification of all the other sectors, like human-driven ride-hail, right? Because these are high mileage vehicles. These are people driving 200 to 350 miles a day. And if you can get them to get into an EV, you're electrifying a lot more miles driven than incentivizing me to buy an EV when I work from home half the time. So I think it's important that we need to be sort of focusing on that side of the picture as well. But we need to keep in mind that the autonomous vehicles are going to eat their lunch. They're going to eat the lunch of the truck drivers, the human truck drivers. Again, it's not a matter of if, it's just a matter of when. I think that the industry is becoming more responsible in putting out more reasonable projections about like when these things are going to be, on the road and actually doing commercial work, as opposed to pilots. But like we're well past the hype cycle, and we're definitely in the valley of despair on this technology. But like this decade is really when it will become a commercial entity. It will start to take away from the human, transportation drivers out there, and that's going to be complicated. There's going to be pushback. There's going to be resistance, and it's a whole nother sort of set of policy woes that we'll have to work on and deal with to make sure that it's done in a way that's equitable.
Yeah, I think there's another interesting kind of nexus here. Kalai, a lot of your research seems to do with carrots and sticks. And the Americans, they don't really like carrots, and they seem to really hate sticks. So like anything else, there's the technology side and there's the policy, political side. And so I'm kind of curious if, solutions that, maybe shift when people charge their vehicles, or even things like congestion pricing to get roads off or cars off roads at peak hours. Do you think those kind of solutions are more likely to be implemented in an autonomous or a semi-autonomous vehicle, where instead of having to tell Jane or Joe driver that they can't do something now, you're just telling the robo-taxi, or as an interim step, the Uber driver?
I haven't thought about that in the autonomous sense. I mean, but people do respond to carrots better than sticks. They like incentives. They're ready to do the change if any incentive is given. Like, for example, like EVs had incentives, fuel cell cars had incentives. In the autonomous sense, like one thing that that still it's in my head, even for general transportation, is this. I wanted to understand how this pandemic's going to change everything. More and more people are going to work from home. So are they still thinking about ownership in that sense? Because that will change everything we think about autonomous driving. People may be more ready to do shared mobility now because they don't travel as much or commute as much. So in that case, it might be easier to regulate autonomous vehicle industry rather than regulating people's own cars. So I don't know what that future would look like. We are slowly coming out of this pandemic. It's very slow, but then we don't know what 3 years from now would look like if we have all gone back to work, or if you're still working on the hybrid world, because that will completely change how people look at commuting and transportation. And that will have a huge effect on autonomy.
Yep. I don't want to make this solely about cars, even though we are a car-focused society, but yeah, there's millions of other ways to get people around. There's trying to push more people onto buses and trains. There's micro-mobility. There's even the more speculative, urban aerial mobility. Rajit, I know part of your research has to do also with buses and another sort of heavier duty vehicle. Yeah, are there significant steps being taken to sort of clean up that mode of transportation?
Very much so. I think the federal government is encouraging by way of incentives and rebates and outright grants electrification of the transit buses. So if you look at the two big places where the buses are used, one is transit, the other is school buses. And a lot of the transit bus operators, and we have relationships with some of them here in California. They already have some electric buses, and they have small numbers, but then they have plans to actually, and they've been doing pilots. And I think one of the important things is the pilots have taught them some lessons, and some of them have been doing pilots for the last 6-7 years. And the lessons have to do with both the vehicles, the charging infrastructure, the communications, and the grid connection, all of the above. So they're sort of now thinking of ramping up slowly, and it requires funding. These buses can be expensive, right? $700,000-800,000 per bus. Now, so that's the one piece of it. The second is school buses. School buses are interesting because they're a little bit smaller. The number of miles they drive is much less than that of a transit bus. That means that they're parked and not used all the time. And interestingly enough, that they're parked at the time when the grid operator oftentimes runs short of energy. That means you can take the battery the energy from the battery in the vehicle and do this thing called vehicle to grid, which is what I've been talking about for the last decade, is a possible technology where you can, when the grid operator is really short of energy and the price of electricity on the grid goes sky high, you can take energy from this bus and send it back to the grid. And that really requires the manufacturers, the charging stations, and the grid operators and the policy makers to actually come together and say, this is how much you're going to get paid, because if you have a degradation of a battery, which even though it's not a whole lot, still you got to have that compensation. So it's a very interesting model, I think, is emerging. And there's already some pilots on using school buses for V2G to help the grid operator. So I think that we are in the pilot stage, and we need to get sort of to higher volumes to actually really get the benefits. And I think when you go to higher volume, that's when the prices of the electric buses will really start to come down, because you'll have many more companies competing and so on and so forth.
Yep, thank you. Colin, I'm curious if your your own experience modeling simulations and whatnot, do you guys also work on transit vehicles or heavy duty vehicles, or is it just?
Oh, no, definitely. Yeah, we were thinking about transit versus walking, biking, micromobility, ride hail, et cetera, and all the trade-offs between all of these. Let me just say one thing about bus electrification and transit electrification. I think very important. I think it's primarily important for the health benefits, because as soon as you put 10, 50, 100 people into a vehicle, the environmental benefits are baked in, right? And you are moving people around way more efficiently. But if they're spewing diesel fumes onto the street, directly into the faces of pedestrians, terrible for people's health. And the reason why we should be electrifying them is because of the emissions reduction. So I think it's a fact that automobiles are here to stay, for better or worse, right? We have designed our entire urban infrastructure around cars, and people have invested in all of their private vehicles, and the political pressure on the mobility system planners is so immense that they can't just overnight essentially put an end to automobile travel. They have to keep that system going, because if they don't, they will be fired. Someone else will be put in their place to keep the highways running. And we need to be honest that this is just a fact of our society, and we should try to make steps to gradually transition to a transportation system that relies more heavily on mass transit, but it is not going to happen overnight. It's going to take decades. And this is why, meanwhile, I think that aggressive policies to electrify the personal vehicles, very important. I think that we also should be doing things, though, to make automobile travel less or more, add more friction into the system. We should be putting in congestion pricing onto our streets. We should be taking lanes off of streets. We should be making it harder, but we can't just make it impossible overnight for people to drive around in their cars. There needs to be a gradual transition. There's still going to be a role for cars. There's still going to be a role for automated fleets. There's still a first mile, last mile problem that is very hard with transit. It's very expensive to get the buses to sort of reach all of the tendrils of the transportation system all the time in a way that makes it convenient for people to use that transit. So we're going to have these collector systems that are taking people in, taking them to the stations. They get on the bus or the BART or the train or whatever, and then they can bypass all of the heavy congestion, which there always will be. So that's my analysis of that.
Yeah, and I think your point about how people on a bus, assuming there's more than one person on the bus, it's inherently greener than other forms of mobility. That I think we can apply that broadly in the sense that as we move to electrify so many forms of transportation, someone on an electric bike or a scooter, it takes way less energy, back at the power plants where you're still gonna have some sort of point source emission, until we go 100% green, than a speculative future where we have people in flying cars and eVTOLs and whatnot. So I want to give you guys all that kind of cue about sort of more speculative forms of transportation, whether they're the scooters on the street today or anything else. Like, give us something as we close this out. Where do you see transportation heading besides just to new fuel systems? So Colin, let's start with you.
Micromobility, absolutely. And I'm actually really excited about the potential for these scooters. I realize it's a little far-fetched, it's going to be a little expensive, but these scooters to be self-driving and they can reposition themselves, that will lower the cost dramatically, because managing all of these scooters, repositioning them, getting them back to charge, et cetera, is a big cost to those systems. And they will be more ubiquitous if we can solve that problem. I think aerial mobility will eventually become something that is sort of accessible to a larger fraction, but I think for the next, I'm going to say 2-3 decades, it will continue to just be something available to the very wealthy people. There are already aerial mobility systems. You can fly around in a helicopter in New York if you are a hedge fund manager, and that must be very convenient for those people. But I do not see it as becoming a sort of mass market mode anytime soon.
Kalai, final thoughts?
Yeah, so one thing that I have been thinking is, having accessible chargers for everyone, like Rajit mentioned, like multi-housing units. There are some promising developments there from China where, they are building chargers within the apartments. It's more accessible. So if we can get that happen, whether in a tiered system or a card lifter or some kind, that will change the entire electrification landscape. More and more people will be able to buy electric cars. So I agree with Colin on urban air mobility. I think there are some there, it's ways off, but unless it's electric, it concerns me. Because we are adding more emissions to the already problematic landscape. So I'm cautiously optimistic about it. So let's see how it goes. And finally, I would like to say I'm yet to see the verdict on how this whole commuting thing changes, because that will have some effect on what kinds of vehicles that people would buy. I hope it doesn't deter them from riding transit. That's a huge question at this point. So yeah, yet to see what are the changes on that.
Exactly. Yeah, and good point about the pandemic. Rajit, final thoughts.
Yeah, so I think that all of the transportation modes are going to keep existing. Buses aren't going away anytime soon, and we use buses, we use trains. I heard some interesting conversation about electrification of trains. in privately owned cars, shared rides, Uber, Lyft. And I think we had a little bit of a issue with Uber, Lyft during the pandemic, but now they're coming back around, and that's not to be ignored, because I know a lot of people who have shed their cars and they use Uber, Lyft to get around, especially in urban areas. Yeah, and so I think that you have all of the above. And I think that if you start thinking about sort of from a transportation management standpoint, what do you actually do, right? What do policymakers do? What do you incentivize, right? Carrot and stick. So we don't want traffic, right? What do we not? We don't want traffic, and we don't want pollution, right? We have some carrots and sticks for traffic. For example, you go on highways, we've got the carpool lane and so on and so forth. And if you have electric vehicle with a sticker, you can go in the carpool, or if you have many people. So you have some of that already. But for pollution, it's still not quite there yet. I mean, if you're driving a SUV that has gas versus an SUV that has electric, right? Yes, certainly still SUV, but at least electric. You're not creating local pollution, and you might be creating pollution somewhere at the source. So that's sort of, but nevertheless, I think California, we're moving towards, a grid that is going to be eventually, have I would say a very large percentage of renewables. So I think that slowly that problem also going to go away at the source problem. But I think that all of them are going to exist. But I think that the policies and incentives, the disincentives are going to play a role as to what I'm going to be doing today. And I think for a lot of the people in California, in big cities in particular, Uber and Lyft are very attractive. And I see a lot of the, the millennials, Gen Z, so forth, they are going Uber, Lyft. They're not buying vehicles. So just something to think about, that we need to include them also in the conversation.
Yep.
And of course,
certainly.
you've heard of Lyft. Lyft has a big program for electric. Uber has a program for autonomous. So autonomous electric technologies are all going to happen. Electric is happening now. Autonomous is coming in sort of different applications. Eventually, autonomous is gonna happen. And there are other technical challenges. I do research in that too, some technical challenges, but I think we're headed in that direction. But I think all of the above, in terms of, the types of transportation modalities.
Yeah, it's certainly a lot to think about. The conversation continues, definitely. If there's one takeaway, it seems to be that California, as usual, leads the way. So Colin, Kalai, Rajit, thank you so much for your time. I hope to keep this conversation going, as I said. To our audience, thank you for tuning in. If you have any questions, we're going to try and get to those in the Q&A or chat box below. And I also hope everyone sticks around for the next fascinating conversation on wildfires. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.
Thanks.